Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be here. I teach, as Paul mentioned, I teach at the Peter F. Drucker School of Management, where we have one of the best arts management programs in the country. I think there's a booth in the hall, so if you have a moment, please check it out. I have to thank Paul for the title, because I would have never had the creativity to come up with the fluctuating inner universe, what the hell is going on with people? Even though I may have thought about it many times. So let's get started. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the big picture and then quickly move to action steps. All right. So what is going on? My whole work is based on Peter Drucker's idea that you can't manage other people unless you manage yourself first. And when I started this over a decade ago, there was no systematic set of practices that you could teach a manager of how to manage their internal world, even though we were all training them to manage the external world. So how do you do this in a way that wasn't therapy, it wasn't religion, it wasn't lighting incense sticks and beating on a bongo drum. It was learning how, frameworks of how your mind worked and how it sometimes didn't work so well and how could you make it better. We all know that the organization experiences the consciousness of the leader, right? That there's a phenomena called emotional contagion, and that whose emotions are the most contagious are the person that's highest in the hierarchy. So if that person has a hard time controlling their own reactive emotions, everyone else experiences it. So how do you teach somebody to do this, to manage that process in a healthier, more effective way? That's basically what I do. So a little bit of interesting data. We could talk about all kinds of things, what is going on in the world, but here's one of my favorites. This is a study from 2000, studying the rates of anxiety over the course of the latter half of the 20th century. One of her key findings was that the average American child in the 1980s reported more anxiety than a child psychiatric patient did in the 1950s. What we consider normal today was pathological 50 years ago, right? And this is data from the 1980s and 90s. So these people are now, functioning adults in the world. So can you imagine that since the 1980s, it's gotten better, right? Another great book, The Shallows by Nicholas Carr. I think the title is How the Internet Was Changing the Way We Think, Read, and Remember. We know now that after a decade's worth of research, that incessant switching back and forth between multiple tasks degrades your brain's ability to pay attention. How that shows up in our world is that, some of my colleagues say, well, my students come in and these are honors students and they can't read books anymore because the text is too demanding. It means that the quality of focus is being degraded, I think, globally, simultaneously. It's a very interesting time we're living in. Some research done at UCLA by a fellow named Russ Poldrack found that not only this issue of information overload, which people have been complaining about since the 1850s, by the way, at least since the 1850s. But then it was, how are we going to deal with all this information? There's so much. Well, what were they complaining about? They were complaining about monthly magazines. But now we may really have hit a kind of tipping point. We know that information overload leads to more stress. That's not probably surprising, because the brain's capacity to hold information is being reached. But that stress further undermines the ability to process more information, right? So it becomes this sort of vicious cycle. Towards the end of the Cold War, the military establishment realized that the neat and tidy framework of East versus West wasn't going to apply anymore, and they needed another framework to figure out, at least to help understand what was going on. And so they developed this one, VUCA. Anybody have an idea what this might stand for? Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. You might notice that this applies to other contexts than military ones. right? And wherever I go, whether it's Tokyo or Stockholm or New York, and whether I'm talking to symphony orchestras or museums or banks or libraries or consulting firms, they all say the same thing. Right? Like the way that we saw the world, the way that we modeled the world somehow isn't working the way it used to. And we're not quite sure what's going to happen. So, is this true for you? Curious to know, right? When we, funding sources, who are your audiences, changes in leadership, changes in assumptions about what leadership is, changes in assumptions about what orchestras are. Right? What's interesting to me in this job that I seem to have going around the world is that this conversation is happening everywhere. Right? Whether it's in a university, which are some of the oldest and most conservative organizations in our society, or banks, that we're facing this kind of massive scale change. Change is not new, but it seems like the change is changing even more, right, later. So you might notice that this is kind of stressful. So I teach 28 weeks worth of material at the Drucker School on how do you manage yourself. And one of the things that we start with, one of the core ideas that we start with, is this idea of how do you cultivate resilience. What Paul didn't mention is that I'm going to be 42 in a few months, and when I was 20, I was diagnosed with a terminal illness and told that I had, at best, a 90% chance of dying within 5 years of that diagnosis. That was in 1992. And I had to learn how to live differently. So I had to learn how to change my own way of seeing myself in the world and seeing how I acted in the world and seeing what I believed about myself in the world, because the way I was doing it was killing me. And all of what we're going to talk about today are kind of the foundations of what I learned, basically. So let's talk about stress. Many of us think about stress in terms of something we need to avoid. What I'd like to suggest is maybe we need to think about resilience as something we need to enhance. But then let's talk about what stress is. Stress is an adaptive function that we all have that helps us mobilize energy to fight or flee. Right? So it's this program that we've inherited that activates when we sense the presence of a predator and we need to either defend ourselves or get out of here. So stress in and of itself is not necessarily negative, right? It's a thing that helps us survive. And it's protective. It's a protective mechanism. If you didn't have it, you have other problems. But we were adapted to live on a relatively unchanging environment, like a savanna in Africa, where the threats to us were kind of quick, right? Like, why do we not like spiders and cockroaches? Because I think one reason is, well, not A, they're ugly, and then B, they move so fast. But our whole neural architecture our alarm system is geared towards kind of fast-moving threats, right, that we need to escape. So if we think about today, the stresses that we deal with are kind of abstracted. They might be chronic, right? How do I think about all this paper? How am I going to pay my mortgage? Do I have enough for my retirement? Did I turn the toaster oven off? Who fed the cat? It's budget, right? Just say budget meeting, right? What happens to your, right? What happens to your nervous system? Right? So when we talk about this idea of managing oneself, first, it's really about managing our survival reactions. And what that means is learning how to manage our nervous system. So what's the nervous system? The nervous system is split into two branches. One side is the parasympathetic and the other side is the sympathetic. We can think about the parasympathetic side as the brake. It calms things down. Brahms, I think, is a parasympathetic sort of guy. Right? So, your heart rate slows down, your muscles relax, your digestion comes back online, right? Your blood pressure goes down. And then the sympathetic nervous side, the nervous system, is all about activity. It's about mobilizing energy. It's about turning glycogen into glycogen into glucose. That's why there's a very clear relationship between chronic stress and diabetes. Right? It's about mobilizing energy into the body to get out of here or to defend myself. Right? Your heart rate goes up, your muscles tense, your jaw girds itself because you might be struck. Right? So your pupils dilate, you start to breathe very shallowly, quickly. Right? So brake on one side, gas pedal on the other, and obviously the stress response is all about the gas pedal. And in a do it better, faster, cheaper sort of environment, right, you can imagine, right, we are pushing ourselves all the time. Implicitly, I think many of us have this model of productivity and stress in our mind about, okay, I make more effort and I'd be more productive. Every college student knows this, right? I'm sure you've all had the experience of, knowing, the paper is due, what time is it? It's almost 2 o'clock. Paper's due tomorrow at noon. Guess I better pick my topic. And then you know what happens. You know the unearthly energies that you can summon to produce this brilliant piece of work in 12 hours or less, and at 1:59, you slide the thing under the prof's door. Right? That's great. That works when you're a teenager, and that works when you're 20. But then you turn 30 or 31 or 32, and God forbid you turn 42, and then all that doesn't work anymore. Right? And you realize you have to operate in a different way. Now, in talking to nonprofit organizations, I've found that there is something which I call the danger of the pursuit of the noble goal. Which means, because our goal is noble, I am going to give everything I've got in pursuit of this. And maybe I'm going to give more than I actually have. So we think that the relationship between stress and productivity is this straight line, but actually it's this, right? So there's some version of some kind of inverted U that, yes, stress and productivity is very good for us, and then at some point we hit a tipping point and not so good for us. Right? It's not true that stress kills you. Okay, that's a falsehood. What is true is that stress exploits weaknesses in your biology that open up windows for something to enter that will kill you. Right? Whether that's a stroke or cancer or diabetes or whatnot. Right? So part of what we talk about is learning how do I recognize when I'm in my resilient zone and when I'm out of it. And that the good news is everybody's got a resilient zone. Now, you might be like my wife, who has a resilient zone as wide as the Mississippi River. Or you might be like me, that has a resilient zone that's like the little piddly creek. Right? So the good news is that we can learn how to widen it. But before that, we have to think about what happens. The body has a certain limitation on the amount of stimulation it can deal with. If we move into a state of what's called hyperarousal, this is sympathetic nervous system activation, fight or flight, you may have noticed, right? Then you get something that looks like this. It's hard to sleep or relax, muscle tension, anxiety attacks, worry, hyperactivity, panic, rage, increased heart rate, short fuses, hypervigilance, racing thoughts, worry, chronic pain, mania and elation, rapid shallow breathing, and yet more worry, right? Keeps coming back. And we can get stuck here. We can get stuck here and we don't realize that's what's actually happening. It's 2 o'clock in the morning and I'm staring up at the ceiling and I wonder when am I going to fall asleep? Because I got to get up at 5, right? This can carry on for a little while, but then the nervous system has its limits and the brake looks over, the parasympathetic nervous system side looks over and says, buddy, you're out of control. And instead of fight or flight, we move into an advanced state of stress called freeze. This is the opposite of having too much energy. This is, I start to not want to get out of bed in the morning. It's the province of depression and disconnection, deadness, exhaustion, low energy, poor digestion, low heart rate, sadness, apathy, and immune system malfunction. The reason why I talk about this in the beginning is that we can experience these things, and we oftentimes, I think the place we go is, oh, there's something wrong with me. There's something wrong with my personality, or there's a character deficiency. But what I want to emphasize is this is nothing about character. This is all about biology. This is an overwhelmed biology that hasn't been managed well. And where did we learn how to manage it well? Right? That's, if we're experiencing levels of anxiety that are pathological, that were considered pathological 50 years ago, where did we learn how to manage any of that well? So that's part of what we'll do today, right now. Okay. I like to say that the language, that the mind speaks 3 languages. One of them is the one we're all taught in, and I will talk about that in a little bit, is the language of thought. I think, therefore I am. This is the hallmark of the modern era. Descartes. We can thank Descartes for this. Right? So, in what we generally call education in the modern West is all about thinking. Right? We teach you to think. We give visas to people who think for a living. Right? So if you have a science, technology, engineering background, it's very easy for you to get a visa compared to if you have an arts background. So as a society, we value conscious, rational thought, which is not a bad thing. I'm not arguing against that. Then maybe you read the book on emotional intelligence, maybe you had good parenting or a good therapist, and we learned how to deal with emotions effectively. But there's a third language, the language of physical sensation, that I think most of us never got any kind of systematic education about. What is that, right? What do you mean, sensation? Okay, here's how we can think about sensation. Sensation is the most fundamental language our body speaks. Right? These are not, look at these words, they're very weird. Twitchy, shivery, blocked, moving, paralyzed, pulsating, moist, clammy, fluid, dense, cold, throbbing, radiating, flushed, prickly, buzzing, nauseous, goosebumps, furry, breathless, pinching, heavy, pounding, tremulous, right? These aren't things we talk about at Thanksgiving dinner. But this is the most fundamental language we speak. This is the language of our nervous system talking to us. And we have not gotten the code of the syntax or meaning of this. So, one question for you. How do you know when you are stressed? What are the physical sensations of that? This is not a rhetorical question. If you're awake. It's a very low bar. Please. Lower back pain, yes.
Clenched jaw.
Say it again. Clenched jaw. Yeah. Headaches. Shortness of breath. Confusion. Irritability. Sweaty. Couple more. How do you sense this in your body? Nausea, yeah. Please. Stiff neck, yes, right. Somebody mentioned tension in the jaw. My dentist was telling me the other day that, people are coming in with their molars ground down because, they've girded their jaw. So, part of what we do is to start to help people realize when they're actually there or when they're headed in that direction. Right? Because for many of us, we don't know until we're way into it. So part of what I think we should think about is how do you start to check in with yourself? As one of my colleagues says, you teach people how to check their own dipstick. Right? So what's going on? How do you recognize when you're there and when you're not there? Right? Let me ask a different question. What does peacefulness feel like? What does calm feel like? How do you notice that in the body? Slow breathing.
Feel content.
Say it again.
Feel content.
Feel content, yeah.
Energetic.
Clear.
Muscles relaxed.
Grounded. Well, smiling, yeah. So notice that this list is slower to generate because we haven't felt it since 1950. But no matter what, we can use methods. There are methods we can use to start to dissipate this reaction, which I thought we could practice. Right? This is called grounding. It's a very basic practice. I teach it to all my executive students. It's the first thing that we learn because I found that since 2008, most people's internal kind of dynamic is far more fragmented and frazzled than it was before 2008. Unless you live in Sweden and they don't have economic problems right now. But this sense of fragmentation I find to become more and more frequent in many, many places. So I'll walk you through this practice first, and then we can spend a minute or two just trying it. All right? So first thing, find a comfortable spot. Right? It's interesting, everybody stayed in their chair, so kudos to you, Weston. Nice chair. Right? So you can just start to put your attention to where you notice comfort. Where do you notice comfort in the body? Where do you notice a sensation of connection, which could be between you and the chair or your feet and the floor? Where do you notice connection? And you rest your attention in that sensation of connection. And that's all you do. That's all you have to do. You're just letting your attention rest in the sensation of connection. Where do you feel supported? And if you notice difficult sensations or unpleasant sensations, say hi to that and then shift your attention back to where you notice comfort. And then as you do that, notice what happens to your breathing, what happens to your heart rate, what happens to your muscle tension. All you have to do is rest in the sensation of connection. So we could stay here until 2:45, which I'd be fine with. But I'm curious to know, even in just a very brief moment, what did you notice? Shoulders dropping. How many people notice, I actually felt a little bit more relaxed, even in this brief moment? Okay, wow. This is something you can do anywhere. You can do it standing up, waiting in line at the grocery store. You can do it sitting down. You're on an airplane. It's a great place to do it, right? I forgot to tell Paul, but one of the guarantees I'll make you is that you'll never be bored again after this talk. You can always do it somewhere. Some of my students do it before they have what they know to be a difficult meeting, so that they walk into the room calm. And oftentimes what they'll say is that, I'm in the meeting and I'm the only calm one. And I get to be the voice of reason, right? Because everyone else has lost it. So I'll send you this PowerPoint which has these directions. But 5 minutes, 1 minute every day. And what happens is that over time you'll start to notice that your resilient zone gets wider. This is not even a kind of complex meditation practice, just a very simple thing. And in the momentum of the day, it's very easy to get swept up in that. And so how can you put in a way, speed bumps in the day to slow down? So what are other ways of pushing the brake? We know that the nervous system is primarily stabilized through physically oriented body practices. So exercise, if you're like me, you're not a big exercise person, the good news is you don't have to do too much of it. 20 minutes 3 times a week, and you can do it in 2 10-minute segments. Exercise, yoga, all of those sort of things. When I started this 10 years ago, a lot of people would walk into the room not even knowing what yoga was. But I'm just curious to know, does anybody have a regular yoga practice? Right? That's amazing. It's how much this culture has changed in a very short period of time. So running, swimming, all of those sort of things help you keep the nervous system in balance. A question I'd like you to ask yourself regularly, both personally and as an organization, are what are your sources of support and replenishment? What do you build in systematically in your day or your week or your month and in your organization and its operations that creates sense of support for one another? And how do you start to revitalize yourself as an organization? Because the danger of the noble mission is that there always are fires to put out. There will always be fires to put out, right? So at home, we're having a lot of contracting done. And it's interesting that when you install a ceiling fan, it means they have to cut 7 holes in the ceiling, which then means you have to call another contractor to fix the ceiling. And then you have to call somebody else to paint the ceiling. And then the cat gets angry. And if Arthur Conan Doyle was documenting my life, this morning we would have had the adventure of the comforter and the cat pee. So there always are fires to put out. So that's not an excuse, right? So how do you build in sources of support and replenishment for yourselves? You have to. Because the structures that we used to have, say, 60 years ago, of a 9-to-5 workday, a real weekend that was a leisure, right? A shift that you could go home from and not think about work, all of those things are not here anymore. Right? And so the external structures that kept us sane and balanced aren't there. So we have to create some kind of internal structure. And that's what we'll talk about next, is how to be productive in this environment. Right? So let's talk about productivity. Most of us, I would gather and guess in this room, grew up in the era of industrialism, or we grew up in institutions that were informed by industrialism. And so the logic of industrial productivity is kind of baked into our bones, which means that time, right? We're trying to maximize time. That was the core industrial variable. How do you maximize output per given unit of time? I would argue that knowledge worker productivity, while of course time is important, doesn't have time as the central variable. Peter Drucker talked about the difference between manual worker productivity and knowledge worker productivity, and that we hadn't yet figured out what were the key dynamics of knowledge worker productivity. Well, let's take a look at the qualities of knowledge work. So I worked in a factory going through college that was a metal plating and metal stamping and electroplating factory. And one of the things we did was electroplate door hinges. My job was to take a barrel of door hinges, sort them in the morning, and stick them on an industrial hanger, and put that hanger on this gigantic machine, which consisted of a series of vats that the hangers would be dipped in. That was before lunch. We'd go to lunch, and you'd come back from lunch, and the hangers were now coming back around, now full of door hinges that were bright and shiny, and we'd have to take them off. That was my job. So at the end of the day, I knew exactly how well I had done, because I could count the door hinges. I knew exactly what my job was. Nobody bothered me, unless the other guys who worked in the factory had cooked up yet their latest plan to torture college boy. Like painting the roof of the factory silver on a bright, sunny July Ohio day. How I was evaluated was very clear. I didn't have particularly complex relationships with the guys at the plant, and at 3:30 when my shift was done, I went home and I did not think about door hinges unless I had nightmares about them chasing me. The primary emotional quality of this work was boredom, because you were doing the same thing hour after hour. Now, think about your work. I would argue that, unless you're a musician, right, which has a very physical quality to it, most of us who are knowledge workers, use our minds for a living. But how many of those qualities of industrial work are true? You know exactly what your responsibilities are, right? That no one interrupts you, right? We're interrupted all the time. Actually, right down here in Irvine, I think now more than a decade ago, somebody did a research showing that workers were interrupted every 3 minutes, something like that, right? We've created work environments that are not conducive to actually getting work done. How many of you come in early or take work home or go in on the weekend, right? I see heads nodding. Now, if I were to say to my foreman, hey, look, boss, I'm going to go do my electroplating at home because I can concentrate better there, right? Doesn't make any sense. But in a knowledge work environment, that's what we actually have, right? Since Herman Miller introduced something called the action office, which you and I know as the cubicle, the dominant thrust of office life for the last 40 to 50 years has been about the removal of barriers. So the action office removed the wall and the door, and then devices like my precious iPhone have removed space-time boundaries altogether. Right? So I can be somewhere, and Waikiki, and somebody's texting me, hey, do you have this? Can you send it over? Right? Work is highly relational. We don't live in tight hierarchies anymore. Right? We don't work in those anymore. And so as peers, I have to convince you to give your limited resources, time, and energy to the thing that I need you to help me with in order to get my work done. Okay? That makes the emotional quality of work really, really interesting, because the quality of our relationship matters a lot more now. So we don't have time-space boundaries, and then, what's the dominant emotional quality of this kind of world, I think, is anxiety. And it points back to the thing I started with. So when we think about productivity, it's primarily focused on the external. Right? So it's usually some kind of technology. But as we've already discussed, we all know that technology itself can undermine productivity. How many times are you, even this morning, I'm preparing a talk, and in the midst of preparing the talk, suddenly a thought pops into my head, check your email. Right? Check your email, check your email. I'm driving down on the 5, listening to the podcast, and then check your email, right? It just shows up. But it doesn't show up just as a thought, it shows up as an urge. But but it's the 5, so it was 5 miles an hour, so it didn't really matter. But let's say in some mythical Southern California where the freeways were actually free, and I was tooling down the 405 at, say, 90, which I've been known to do, and then I start checking my email, right? That's not going to turn out so well. So there's now over a decade's worth of research that shows that multitasking is a fantastic strategy for making mistakes, for taking more time, and for irritating the hell out of everyone around you. Right? I give an exercise to the people I work with. Spend a week watching your own multitasking behavior. What's the narrative inside your head when you're multitasking to somebody? The narrative inside people's head when they're multitasking to somebody is, I am so important. I got so much stuff to do. What do you want? And then about midweek, we flip the game around and say, what's the internal narrative in your head when somebody is multitasking to you? I'm unimportant. I feel unheard. Does this guy not care about me? What the hell am I doing here? Right? And so we're living in this kind of strange mirror universe of disconnection. So if the external world, I think, has been maybe squeezed out of, all the productivity that we can get out of that maybe has been squeezed out, which assumes, of course, that the humans are doing the work, which in 15 years may not be the case anymore, then maybe we have to have an internal approach. And can we learn to use our minds more effectively? Now, we started this with managing survival responses because survival responses undermine our ability to use our minds effectively. You probably have no doubt noticed that you don't make the best decisions under duress or when you're feeling stressed out or anxious, right? And there are neurological reasons why, because your higher cortical functions are offline. So how do we use our minds more effectively? So if we think about managing organizations and this idea of managing oneself, for me, the idea of managing oneself is really about managing a moment. How do you start to manage a moment in time? How do you manage yourself in a moment of time? And if we're managing moments, what we're really talking about is managing your attention. So here's my thesis, that focused attention generates productive power. I think every musician knows this, right? I mean, this is the unique competitive advantage artists have over other folks, is that there's a keen understanding of the importance of focused attention and performance. But wait, well, what's attention? So we can kind of start to understand what attention is if we consider extremes, right? Maybe you know this person. As I mentioned, we know that fragmenting attention produces poor results, right? There's now a decade's worth of research that shows this. Why, in an office environment, do we assume this is effective when maybe she leaves the office and goes and does this? She would never multitask while rock climbing. Right? You'd never multitask playing a game of tennis. Right? You might multitask playing a game of chess, but you'll definitely lose. Right? So why does it make sense to do it in a context like this, to have focused attention, but not here? In fact, one of the great insights of industrialism was that was all about focusing your attention. You only had to do one thing. Right? So we're still kind of on a learning curve here. So one of the questions I have is, how are you using your attention? How are you using your attention as an organization? How are you using your attention as a person? What are the structures in your office environment that are there to either help or hinder your quality of attention? A wonderful example of this is a student of mine who said, I'm very frustrated in my job, and I don't know why, because to be honest with you, I'm good at it. I know this work. I'm good at it, but I'm frustrated. So she goes into the office the next day with this lens of seeing the workspace through the notion of quality of attention, and she suddenly notices that by her door is the office copy machine. And so when anybody in the office was standing there waiting for their copies, they'd stick their head in her door. And she was interrupted constantly. And she said, I could never focus. I picked up the phone, made one call, called facilities. That copy machine was moved to the other corner of the universe. And for the first time, I had a day at the end of which I felt satisfied. I think, especially when it comes to multitasking, we confuse stimulation with satisfaction. Right? To go back to the freeway, right? Because I think all of life's lessons can be learned on the freeways of Southern California. The equivalent of this is, you're stuck in traffic, you want to move, what do? You get off and you work the side streets, right? But what happens? It takes 3 times longer to get there because this sense of motion doesn't actually translate into an effective result. Right? So, now, unless you have any kind of doubt about this, we could do a little experiment. But in the interest of time, what I'll do is show you the experiment, and you can experiment on the people you work and live with and see what happens. But here's the experiment. You take out a piece of paper and you draw 4 lines. I have to say, I got this from my friend Rasmus Hogard at the Potential Project in Copenhagen, Denmark. Thank you, Rasmus. 4 4 lines on a piece of paper. This also involves a timer. Then you have them write out the sentence, multitasking makes me smart. And then you have them write out the numbers 1 through 25. Most people can do this in 30 to 20 to 35 seconds or so. That's what that red circle is for. You write down the time. Then you say, okay, you happy with that, satisfied? All right, now let's try this. So instead of writing one and then the other, you write them back and forth. So then you write an M, then a 1, then a U, then a 2, then an L, then a 3, then a T, then a 4. And for most people, this will take 40 seconds to a minute and a half. Nobody will make a mistake in the first set, and a lot more people will make mistakes in the second, I promise you. Now we have something to do for Thanksgiving, right? So, what does it mean to be educated? As I mentioned, for us in the Western world, we put our eggs in Descartes' basket. I think, therefore I am. We train people to think. Drucker understood we'd kind of overinvested in that. And he said, we've trained people to say, I think, therefore I am, but also we need to train them to say, I see, therefore I am. That we've trained people to be really good at the conceptual, rational aspects of using our mind, but we have not trained people to be really good at being able to see, to perceive things. Right? So another experiment. This one we can do. Hold out your hand, and then just take a look at it for a second. And then imagine it's not your hand, that it's the first time you've seen this particular hand. And in the first time of seeing this particular hand, I'm curious to know, do you see anything you haven't noticed before? Anybody? Say it again? Lines, veins. Yeah. So some people will say, oh, I noticed veins. Other people will say, oh, I noticed there's wrinkles here. Or what's that spot doing there? Or I never realized I poked myself with pencil lead in the 7th grade and it's still there. Right? I asked this of a person the other day and they said, oh, it looks like it's a work of art. Right? So what happens, we've seen our hands every day, but sometimes we actually we fail to stop and actually look at what's going on. The more we're exposed to something, the more we build up a map of that something, and the more we use to see the map. We use the map to interpret the world rather than actually watching what's happening. Right? This is the phenomenon. This explains why you can open up the refrigerator to look for the milk and not see the milk. And then somebody goes and opens up the refrigerator and looks for the milk and says, what are you talking about? The milk is right here, right? Along with your car keys, honey. But, right? Because we're using our map of the fridge and not actually looking at the fridge. And this is true for many, many things in our life, whether it's our emotional patterns or our assumptions about the market or our assumptions about human beings, whatever, right? We're working from a map. That's the one thing people forgot to tell us. Oh, by the way, you're working from a map of the world. Make sure you update it every once in a while. So we learn how to manage and cultivate attention to be able to do that. In fact, William James, over 100 years ago, had this idea that voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. And you can't master yourself unless you do this. And that the education which should improve this would be the education par excellence. And then the next line he says, yeah, but too bad, it's a great idea, but we really don't have any way of making this happen. Now, had he lived another 50 years and gotten a Fulbright grant, he could have gone to Japan, where training attention is the starting place for education. Traditionally, it was understood that a strong, stable, present-centered attention was the baseline for effectiveness. Right? So, There's this kind of classic Zen tale. The takeaway message is the most profound truth is attention, right? Cultivating quality of attention. So as I think I said before, right, we're all, in industrialism, we're obsessed with time. This idea of quality time. I'm going to have quality time with my family, quality time with my kids, quality time with my wife. Definitely going to have quality time with the cat tonight. But I don't think when we say quality time, we really mean time. What we mean is to have quality attention. Right? And so, at least in Japan, you had the creation of all of these attention-developing arts. Tea ceremony, calligraphy, archery, swordplay, flower arrangement. They were all different ways of cultivating strong, stable attention. Now, in the last 10 or 15 years, we have had, perhaps you've heard of this term, mindfulness. It is a kind of high-quality attention. And for over 40 years of research, it shows that you can develop your attention, right? In the West, we never thought about, we have developmental theories for cognition, we have developmental theories for biology, we have developmental theories for emotions, we have developmental theories for morality, but we don't have a developmental theory and practice for attention. Isn't that weird? Right? It's like the most fundamental thing about being alive, and we didn't come up with a theory about how it works. But we do have a growing body of research that shows that when you develop attention, all of these really interesting things happen, right? That it has shown to have positive medical benefits for things like psoriasis, chronic pain, fibromyalgia, cancer, multiple sclerosis, tension headaches, hypertension, irritable bowel syndrome, and immune functioning. If we go to the psychobehavioral side of it, we know that there's decreased depression, decreased anxiety, decreased panic attacks, decreased insomnia, decreased binge eating, decreased symptoms of ADHD, decreased symptoms of OCD, which is obsessive compulsive disorder, decreased smoking abuse, substance abuse, and it helps people stop smoking. In fact, the leading method for helping people stop smoking is based on mindfulness practice, developed by a fellow named Judson Brewer at Yale. Now, let's look at brain function. We know that if you cultivate mindfulness, you have obviously an increased capacity and attention, an increased ability to concentrate, an increased ability to have creative solutions, to solve problems, your memory is enhanced, you become more flexible, you have more ethical decision making, and you see reality with less distortion, right? You see beyond your own emotional projections. So you might be asking yourself, well, how can enhanced attention transform my results? So let's take a look. There are two kinds of results. What do you think they are? Say it again?
Positive and negative.
Yeah, positive and negative, right? The results you want and the results you don't want. Now, sometimes the results you want come along with the results you don't want. We call that marriage. It's not my marriage. I have to go on the record for that. Maybe my cat, but where do results come from? Here's a chart which I cooked up to teach people about mindfulness in 15 minutes or less. We have a result. The result comes from some action. I'm going to read it from the bottom up. The result comes from some action, right? That makes sense. The action itself comes from the sense of choice we have. The sense of choice we have is informed by where we're putting our awareness, what we're aware of, what are our assumptions, right? Are my emotions clouding my awareness? My awareness is informed by where I put my attention, right? Where am I putting my energy? And my attention is influenced by my intention. What I want influences what I select out of my experience. So if I want to eat healthy, I'll look for hummus and carrot sticks, right? But if I don't want to eat healthy, I'll go find the taco truck over there, right? So what I want influences what I'm looking for. Think about that as an organizational strategy. What are you wanting? What's the result you want? Here are a couple of ways of thinking about this, right? Questions you can ask yourself. What's my goal? right? What is actually our goal in doing this? Right? Where's my focus and energy? One problem I think that managers get themselves into is because we're paid to solve problems, we over-focus on problems. Right? And so then all of our attention is subsumed by problems. And we start to get myopic. And when we get myopic, we get hopeless. So where's my focus and energy? What do I know? Right? What's informing what I know? What do I assume? Different questions asked here. What do I assume? What am I expecting? What do I judge as right or true? What do I see as my options? And is this all there is? Right? I was working with one of our leadership fellows last week. I was working with a group of people which he had convinced himself were total idiots. And he didn't see any options because his judgmental mindset had backed him into a cul-de-sac where there were no other options because he decided these people were idiots. And then when we probed a little further, it turned out actually they weren't idiots, but the system that had been created for them to help get their job done, it was malfunctioning, was dysfunctional. And so they were responding to what the system was asking of them. Very rationally, actually. And so once we figured out how to shift the system, which basically involved building in a feedback mechanism for their performance, they suddenly became less idiotic. Right? So what are our options? What do I do? And then in terms of result, what do I receive? Am I getting the result I want? Are we as the organization getting the result we want? Right? What is the result we want? And so are intention and result aligned? That's when you get effective results. So let's go through a couple of case studies. I'm sorry, this is a misplaced slide. So yes, so the key is, we are going to cultivate attention. Because as you cultivate attention, it improves this whole thing upstream and downstream. You might know that I'm a Sherlock Holmes fan, but let me give you what I call the case of the multitasking manager. This is a real case from the files of a student of mine who worked for a $2 billion food company who was the chief information officer of that company. We talked about the findings on multitasking. He has a weekly meeting, like I'm sure many of you have a weekly meeting, and he's decided that for that weekly meeting, which was 90 minutes long, that he was going to stand outside the meeting room with a cardboard box, and as people walked into the meeting, they had to put their BlackBerry or their iPhone or whatever it was in that box. And he said, I sat down, I put the box in a corner, it was buzzing and humming and vibrating, and that everybody was twitching. He said it was like being in a rehab ward. And he said they spent most of the meeting angry at me. And then I did it the next week, and then I did it the next week, and I did it the next week. And eventually the 90-minute meeting turned into a 60-minute meeting. And that we had conversations about the issues the organization was facing, and we actually started to solve them. We didn't have to reschedule another meeting because people weren't paying attention in the first meeting. Right? So we didn't have to have another meeting about the meeting we had to have because we didn't have to be in that meeting anymore. Right? So this man implemented this idea of device-free encounters through his entire calendar. And he asked people, if you were going to come meet with me, please leave your laptop or your whatever in your cubicle. And he said, he goes, it's not rocket science. I sat down, I got a little table and a little chair, two little chairs, and I sat down with them, and we just actually had a conversation. Right? What have we come to where innovation now means just pay attention? Right? And he said, we solved the problem. We had the conversation, and we solved the problem, and we can move on. I wasn't just, hold on a second, check. Right? That man conservatively estimated that he had 2 to 3 discovered discretionary hours a day simply because of doing this. So you're a C-suite executive and suddenly you have conservatively 40 free hours a month that you didn't have before, right? The simplest, quickest, easiest productivity gain you can gain as an organization is to simply do what we did in 1950, which was, when you're in the meeting, be in the meeting, right? It's like something we've forgotten. It's an easy win, right? But I guarantee you'll have to endure at least 3 weeks of people's emotional reactions about it. But it's an easy one. So let me move on. Another one, the case of the annoying associate. So that was about how he was using his attention, right? He realized that attention was fragmented and that they weren't getting a result. So they had to figure out a way, how do we get people's attention back in the room? Get rid of the devices. It changed the result. So let's talk about the case of the annoying associate. Annoying associate is an employee for an organization that she was hired to do a specific function for, right? The person being annoyed is her boss, who was my client. What the annoying associate would do is stand in the doorway and talk incessantly to the boss. The boss, not wanting to talk to the annoying associate because she was so annoying, would do this. And unfortunately, not being telepathic, the annoying associate didn't know that she was being sent messages, go away, go away, go away, go away. Instead, she kept talking because obviously the boss isn't hearing what I'm saying. And they went around and around and around and around like that, right? So the result was, not effective for the boss, the associate, or the organization. So I did a little probing. I said, okay, so you're upset, right? You're upset with this person. Now let's switch your point of view. Switch your attention to their point of view. Why are you in the doorway talking to your boss? So we had to get over the emotional reaction of just because of the answer of, because I'm an incompetent nincompoop. Now, what's the real reason why? She was quiet for a minute. And then I asked, when you hired this person, were you clear and conscious about explaining to her what success was in your organization for her and what your expectations for her work were? No. Do you think that her standing in your office door is a way of trying to get that feedback? Maybe. And at this point, the tears are flowing because she realized that she had created and perpetuated this entire situation herself. But her emotional reaction, right, caught up, took away her attention. And so her awareness was clouded by the dislike that she had developed for this person she hired to perform a function for her organization, right? And so, the superpower of having a high-quality attention is to be able to see that dynamic as it's happening and step out of it, right? To not pretend that she's not there, act passive-aggressively, and then allow it to persist. So, one further one, and we'll close on this note. It's the case of the exhausted executive, who actually lives in Orange County, so be careful. The very high-functioning person. Works in a medical context, actually a very highly placed executive, very demanding position, very talented person, very well-liked person. I kind of think of her as the mom of the idyllic 1970s TV show about a family that you'd want to spend your holidays with, right? Maybe they drove a bus, I don't know. You just imagine that these are fantastic people, right? Has a very nice family, very good human being. And she sent me a letter one day saying, wow, I realize that I have spent my entire professional life ignoring my body. And that maybe, and then she went on to list 6 different diagnoses, 3 of which were cancer and 3 of which were autoimmune diseases, that maybe these diagnoses were a result of her ignoring what her body was trying to tell her. Because when push came to shove, she had to, quote unquote, power through. Right? She was focused on achieving her external goals, and she ignored what her body was telling us. And so what she found was that mindfulness, having this high level of attention to her body, gave her the awareness to realize when she was actually tired and that she needed to take a break. Right? Wow, it's 2:45 and I'm at the last slide. I don't know how that happens, but here it is. So, would it be okay to take a couple minutes for questions or comments or thoughts? Yeah. So take care of your attention, first of all. Right? And then how do you build in structures for your own renewal? And then understand what is it you really want as an organization. And it's that result, focusing on that result, getting that result is what moves forward. That's the compelling vision that energizes people. There's a whole other talk I wanted to give on transitions, but I looked at the 125 slides I put together and realized there was no way in an hour, 15 minutes I could talk about it. So for a minute, I'm going to talk about it. Transitions happen in 3 stages. I think that we're a world in transition, and most of our institutions are in some kind of transition. Transitions begin with endings. Something ends. A way of living ends. And then we move on to a middle period, the new beginning. But before that, we have to be Moses wandering in the desert. And it's this long, involved, unpleasant middle period of exploring, being disoriented, not knowing what's going on, which is, I think, where most of us are at. What's going on, right? But in order to successfully navigate that middle zone, you have to try to do new stuff, form new kinds of relationships, set different kinds of goals than before, because the old world is dead. That's the challenge. That's a challenge. I can't claim to be an expert in your world. But what I have found is that is the challenge for many, many organizations right now, is the exploration to figure out what are we going to be. Because we can't go back, even though it's so alluring to go back. Because I know that. I know that world. That's comfortable. And this wandering in the desert thing, I don't like it. The good news is you're not supposed to like it. It's not supposed to feel good. The even better news is that if you persist at it, as I mentioned, letting go of old stuff, trying new stuff, forming new kinds of relationships and alliances, we start to get ideas of how we can do something differently. And that's what leads to the new beginning. So, thank you.